Hey, welcome back to the show for the April episode of Buddha and the Slut. Keeping at it monthly now for the spring and summer, but I'm seriously considering coming back on a bi-weekly basis in the fall. Let me know what you think about that and what you think of the balance between these random, off-the-cuff kind of rants that I can do for 15 or 20 minutes, I think, and pre-written stories. Like the ones that seem to be some of your favorites from the past. But I know that there are some of you that like it off the cuff, and there are some of you that like it raw, and there are others of you that just want a narrative, so let me know what you think. This one is going to be, strangely, a little mix of both, and the pre-written part is not going to come from me. In fact, well, let's get into it. We have all witnessed the what I even wrote on Facebook as a perfect example of a cultural tragedy, the burning of the Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, France. Now, of course, when I turned on the television. No, when I clicked on the internet and I saw all the reactions happening to the live burn of this beautiful place, this cultural icon, this place that I have visited several times. In fact, the first time that I went to Paris and visited Notre Dame, it was right before I walked the Santiago de Compostela, the Camino in southern France across the Pyrenees through Spain, and this was back in 2008, and I was blessed when I was there to witness a live pipe organ performance in the cathedral, and it was, without a doubt, it was transcendent. The acoustics in that place, combined with the astounding architecture, you could feel the magic from the sacred geometry in the space, from the thousands of craftsmen and women, the artisans who built it, from the vision of this ode to humanity and divinity that was created over generation after generation after generation, the vision that went beyond oneself, just the short-term thought of this is going to be for me. No, this is going to be for others. This is truly legacy. It's breathtaking. It's hard to even put into words. It's what inspires the human spirit, both in a creative way and in a functional, foundational way, a cultural way, and in ways that, of course, cannot be measured. So I was with the thousands, the scores of others who felt something tangible, a tangible sadness, a measure of despair at witnessing the potential destruction of this breathtaking icon to the human spirit and to the divine. And yet, at the same time, after a couple of days, at the same time after a few days, and it started to settle, I realized something's wrong, something's missing here, because in that same frame of time, or with relative recency, there have been these tragedies popping up around the world, from the flooding in Mozambique to the continued bombing and the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, to, of course, the issues with Syria and all of the immigrants desperate for homes and everyone holding up their hands saying, no, thank you, we've had enough of you, thank you very much, the virtual fencing off and tensions there, to, of course, all the problems in the States and everywhere else. And then let's not even start on what's pretty much the grin-wearing, polite-faced mass genocide happening in Palestine. All right? Let's just call a spade, as they say. And yet, there's no reaction to this, or to these things. Minimal reaction, kind of like, oh, that's too bad. That's sad, that's frustrating, that's maddening. But did you see and witness the response in the real world and the virtual to the burning of Notre Dame Cathedral? At this point, I think over $1 billion has been pledged to rebuild it, to make it what it was, or somehow get it a close approximation to what it was, approaching its former glory. And that's commendable, that's beautiful. But these other more humanitarian tragedies, the imminent collapse of our goddamn environment, we're like, well, what can we do? Is it a case of these things are just too big to even process? Or is it more a matter of a painful truth, which is these things, especially in this privileged, hey, let's again call a spade, the white world that we live in, this rich and entitled world that we live in the West? Is it a case of these things are just too foreign from us? Is it a painful case of tribalism, again, rearing its ugly and unfortunate head? And when I think about that, I flash back to, and I tell this to a lot of friends of mine, to the one thing that made university worth paying thousands and thousands of dollars for. It was a book I read in fourth year mass communication theory class by a social theorist named Christopher Lasch. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I think he wrote this book in the late 70s or early 80s, and it's called Culture of Narcissism. And it stuck with me. Yes, it was an academic text, but it was brief, and it was also very well written. And it stuck with me because I had a feeling he was right in the thesis or the theses that he put forward. And it ended up, he absolutely was right, a complete cultural bullseye. It was almost as if he was clairvoyant, pointing out that with technology and the way that world was moving and the way we're moving towards, like, currency management and American hegemony, or at least, the Western idea of hegemony around the world, and also the Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village, with how technology was going to bring us together and make everything instantaneous. We'll be able to have windows into each other's worlds. That actually what that was going to end up triggering and being a catalyst for is not just like 15 minutes of fame, maybe like 15 seconds of fame, but this turning into the self, this hyper tribalism of the one or the very, very few. And if you're on my side, this is about me, and how we're holding up these devices in our pockets and making every single moment possible about me, about myself, about the I. And it's going to become harder and harder to relate to others collectively, even to see others as part of or a reflection of or an extension of oneself. So really this comes up to a case of what some have dubbed the death of, or the end of, empathy. And this brings me to the thing that I want to read. This is an article that popped up on my feed, thanks to Sean Embry, of an article from National Public Radio, from NPR, as part of their special series. And it's called, fittingly enough, The End of Empathy. And it's by a writer named Hannah Rosen. And I'm gonna read it pretty much verbatim. I might kind of smooth things over here and there that suits my language without changing facts that she shared. Plus, I'm going to interject occasionally with comments of my own from my own life experience. But I wanted to read this to you because I think it is timely, painfully so. So let's get to it. The article is called The End of Empathy, and I would love to hear your comments on this afterwards. Militia leader Ammon Bundy, famous for leading an armed standoff in Oregon, had a tender moment in November last year. He recorded a Facebook post saying that perhaps President Trump's characterization of the migrant caravan on the US-Mexico border was somewhat broad. That maybe they weren't all criminals, he said. Well, what about those who have come here for reasons of need? So Bundy did not say he was breaking with Trump. He just asked his followers to put themselves in the shoes of the fathers and the mothers and the children who came to escape violence. It was a call for a truce grounded in empathy, the kind you might hear in a war zone or on an Easter Sunday sermon. Yet still, it was met with a swift and rageful response from his followers, so overwhelming that within days, Bundy decided to quit Facebook. Now, in an earlier era, Bundy's appeal might have resonated, but he failed to tune in to a critical shift in American, and I would think, overall Western culture, one that a handful of researchers have been tracking with some alarm for the past decade or so, and I would say even more than that. Westerners these days seem to be losing their appetite for empathy, but especially the walk a mile in someone's shoes Easter Sunday morning kind. Now, when I was growing up in the 70s, same as this author, empathy was all the rage. The term was coined in 1908, and then social scientists and psychologists started more aggressively pushing the concept into the culture after World War II, basically out of fear. Because the idea was that we were all going to kill each other with nukes or something else, and we had to either do that or learn to see the world through each other's eyes. Now, in the early elementary school times of the 70s, which was not progressive really if you look back at that, or mushy in any way, or liberal left-leaning, our teacher had us write letters to pretend Russian pen pals to teach us to open our heart to our, quote, enemies, unquote. And not just enemies. Civil rights activists had also picked up on the idea. Kenneth Clark, a social scientist and civil rights activist, half-jokingly proposed that people in power should all be required to take an empathy pill so they could make better decisions. His hope was that people with power and privilege would one day inhabit the realities of people without power, not from the safe noblesse oblige distance of pity, but from the inside. An evolved person was an empathetic person, choosing understanding over fear. But then, more than a decade ago, a certain suspicion of empathy started to creep in, particularly amongst, as the author says here, young people. And I can't believe I am saying young people, but I guess pushing 50, I need to say young people. One of the first people to notice was Sarah Conrath, an associate professor and researcher at Indiana University. And since the late 60s, researchers have surveyed young people on their levels of empathy, testing their agreement with statements such as, "It's not really my problem if others are in trouble and need help," or, "Before criticizing somebody, I try to imagine how I would feel if I were in their place." Now, Conrath collected decades of studies and noticed a serious pattern. Starting around 2000, the line starts to slide. More students now say it's not their problem to help people in trouble, not their job to see the world from someone else's perspective. By 2009, on all the standard measures, Conrath, the researcher, found that young people on average measure 40% less empathetic than our generation, my generation, the author's generation. 40%. I think it's fucking strange to think of empathy, a normal, natural human impulse, as fluctuating like this, moving up and down like consumer confidence, like the stock market. But that's what happened. Again, these young people, quote unquote, just started questioning what my elementary school teachers had taught me. Their feeling was, why should they put themselves in the shoes of someone who was not them, much less someone they thought was harmful? In fact, cutting someone off from empathy was the positive value, a way to make a stand, to put a line in the sand. Okay, so the author says here, for example, when the wife of white nationalist Richard Spencer recently told BuzzFeed he had abused her, the question debated on the lefty internet, as they say, was, why should we care that some woman who chose to ally herself with a nasty racist got herself hurt? Why waste empathy on that? The new rule for empathy seems to be reserve it not for your enemies, quote unquote, but for the people you believe are hurt, or you have decided need it most. Empathy, yes, but just for your own side. And empathizing with the other team, that's practically taboo now. And it turns out that this brand of selective empathy is a very powerful force in modern day living. In the past 20 years, psychologists and neurologists have started to look at how empathy actually works, like in our brains and in our hearts, when we're not thinking about it. And one thing they've found is that one of the strongest triggers for human empathy is observing some kind of conflict between two other parties. And this is said by Fritz Breithaupt, I hope I pronounced that correctly, a professor at Indiana University who studies empathy. Now, quote, once they take the side, they're drawn into that perspective, and that can lead to very strong empathy and too strong polarization, or as I would say, hyper-tribalism, with something you only see this one side of and not the other side any longer. Now, classic examples of this, the author says the Super Bowl, but hey, I'm Canadian, so the Stanley Cup would do. My team from my geographical area is better than your team from your geographical area. If you don't believe that's true, come to Vancouver during a Stanley Cup final. All right, check out the riots at the beginning of my stay in that city and the end of my stay in that city. Those were my cultural bookend experiences. But these days, in the news, examples come up all the time. You've got the Kavanaugh hearings, you've got Louis C.K. and Me Too, you've got emergency funding for a wall to keep Mexicans out, you've got Spike Lee walking out of the Oscars. You've got every other tweet on Twitter. Researchers who study empathy have noticed that it's actually really hard to do what we were striving for in my generation, 70s and 80s. Empathize with people who are different than you are, much less people you don't like. But if researchers set up a conflict, people get into automatic empathy overdrive, but only with their own team. This new research has scrambled notions of how empathy works as a force in the world. For example, We often think of terrorists as shockingly blind to the suffering of innocents. And this might be controversial, but Breithaupt and other researchers think of them as classic examples of people afflicted with an excess of empathy. They feel the suffering of their own people deeply, hence how far they're willing to go. Now, Breithaupt called his new book The Dark Sides of Empathy, because there's a point at which empathy doesn't even look like the kind of universal empathy that I think we were all taught in school. There is a natural way that empathy gets triggered in the brain. Your pain centers light up when you see another person suffering. But out in the world, it starts to look more like what I said from Christopher Lash's book, like tribalism, hyper-tribalism, a way to keep reinforcing your own point of view and blocking out any others. This is a moment where I'm going to interject, because it says here, like triggering the pain, you get the pain centers of your brain light up when you see another person suffering. I just always assumed that happened to everyone. It took me probably 3 decades plus to realize it wasn't as common as I believed it to be. It wasn't a universal experience. I think I flash back to a moment in my late 20s, and I'm sitting in my living room with my roommate and her boyfriend, good old boy and girl from, central BC, and my girlfriend. And we had all indulged in a bit of Vancouver's greenest finest, so you can kind of guess the state that we were in, and we were watching Oliver Stone's Natural Born Killers. You might be able to guess where this is going to go. About a half an hour, maybe 25 minutes into the movie, there was this really intense scene, I think, where Rodney Dangerfield played the father of Juliette Lewis's character and was implying molestation and child abuse. And then Woody Harrelson's character comes in and does something horrifically violent. And, normally that would be somewhat entertaining, this like hyper violence, this stylized thing that Stone was trying to get across. But I remember, I was only a little bit high, it wasn't that bad, but I remember viscerally feeling each stab and each punch and each horrific thing that was happening, each emotion the characters were portraying, from fear to intense hatred and rage to the extreme violence to the physical pain that they were suffering. So much so that I ran out of the room with my hands clasped over my mouth and vomit spewing out between my fingers. And then I had to go into my room, turn the lights out, and twitch in the darkness to process all of that emotion. And I could hear my girlfriend defending me out in the living room saying, well, he's just a really sensitive guy. He's feeling everything that's happening to these characters on the screen. That's why he reacted that way. And my roommate's boyfriend was like, that's fucking weird. I never thought it was weird. But I guess extreme empathy, especially these days, is we are unable to put ourselves truly into the emotional shoes, into the suffering of another. I don't know if that makes me a better person or a worse person, but it's scary to think that this is not a uniform, universal human experience. Maybe that was one of the things that inspired me to make my old series Broken Saints, which had an empath at the center of it as the cog in the machine to trigger a divine experience worldwide simultaneously. Yeah, check out Broken Saints, and the character's name is Shandala. Anyway, I'm getting off topic. So let's come back to the article. So here she says that we can't return to my generation's era of empathy and innocence because we now know too much about how the force actually works. Now, Breithaupt, the author of The Last Study, is alarmed at the apparent new virus of selective empathy and how it's deepening these divisions, again enforcing hyper-tribalism. If we embrace that, he says, then basically you give up on civil society at that point. You give up on the idea of democracy, because if you feed into this division more and more and you let it happen, it will become so strong that it becomes dangerous, like tipping point dangerous. But we can't give up on empathy either, because empathy is like, some say 90% of what our life is all about. Without it, we would just be alone. We would be islands unto ourselves. And as they've shown with with rodents and with mammals in captivity, isolation breeds despair, and that eventually leads to death. Now, in that researcher Breithaupt's book, he proposes what I guess the author thinks is an ingenious solution: to give up on the idea that when we are empathizing with others, we are being altruistic or helping the less fortunate or in any way doing, quote, good, unquote. Our empathy is not making us better. Now, what we can do when we do the whole empathy thing is try to help ourselves. we can try to learn to see the world through the eyes of, let's say, a migrant child, or a militia leader, or that Russian pen pal we wrote to in public school. Try to see through those eyes purely, so we can maybe, just maybe, expand our own imaginations, make our own minds, hearts, and souls richer. Now sure, that could be seen as a selfish kind of empathy. It's not saintly by any stretch. But as the author says at the end, it's better than being alone. Now, I'm going to end this little story, this little cast, with something else that's been in the news a lot lately, with the environmental catastrophe that is at our doorsteps. And how does that tie to empathy? Well, we can relate to our tribe, but maybe the planet is just too big. And I'm taken back to an old story, to an anecdote from the great environmentalist David Suzuki, Go Canada. And he was telling the story of being at, I think it was like a $500 per plate dinner in Toronto with all these great minds gathered, and Prince Charles was there, going from table to table and meeting people. And as part of this foundation, he apparently supports both, the history and architectural and cultural influences around the world, which ties this whole thing into the Notre Dame burning. But also he's an environmentalist, apparently. Now, he comes to David Suzuki's table, and it's assembled with some great thinkers and people who are influential socially and culturally in Canada and beyond. And he goes, please, I would like you to tell me what you think is the biggest problem facing the modern world at this time. And so a banker or an economist is saying, balancing the global economy, getting currency and trade borders to open up, and making sure we have continued growth. And another person across the table from him says, that's insane. All right, do you see the distance between the haves and have-nots? We need to have minority equality. We need to worry about, people of color. We need to worry about women, and we need to worry about the LGBTQ community. This is the most important thing facing society. And then you have someone else at the table going, well, what about religion? This is what drives people the most every day in their lives, and we have to make sure that we don't, create a monotheistic culture. There must be freedom for all people to express their divine rights and their divine beliefs, and to not be persecuted based upon which way the pendulum is swinging politically and spiritually in the world. And Suzuki, after swallowing all this, turns to Prince Charles and says, and this is paraphrasing maybe, but he apparently said, okay, you know what? We are in a car speeding towards a brick wall at 300 miles per hour, and all of you are arguing who gets to ride shotgun. The most important thing in the world, which none of you are empathizing with, you are only empathizing with your own tribe and your own desires and your own needs, is if we can't live on this rock anymore, if we make it unsustainable to keep surviving, we are all going to die, and none of your issues are going to matter anymore. And to tie it in with the thesis of this podcast, that does indeed seem to be a problem with empathy. If we can't look at the living creatures, at the forests, at the seas, if we can't view this living being that's spinning through the void that we live upon, Gaia, Mother Earth, if we can't see it as something that's vital and alive and experiencing suffering at our hands, if we can't empathize with it, do we even deserve to go on? Something to think about.